So this is an introduction to the rest of the book, and these are chapters that I'm worried that we won't cover, although if there's high demand for one, maybe you can influence what's presented. Chapter 12 is on game theory. It really enriches a lot of the models that were barely introduced in chapter 11 and builds up some of the implications of those models. Learning about game theory is great. If you have any interest in international relations or political science, I encourage you to read that chapter pretty carefully. Chapter 15 is about general equilibrium. General equilibrium is a great way to start thinking about what I barely introduced when we talked about imperfect competition, which is sort of the supplied welfare analysis. Is the society maximizing the sum of producer surplus and consumer surplus? That kind of analysis gets complex very quickly, but is certainly interesting, and the law of unintended consequences is really important when you start thinking about how to intervene in the way that society works in general. Chapter 16 is about asymmetric information. What that means is that one of the parties, either the buyer or the seller, might know more than the other party. And the chapter develops some of the implications of that. So for Texas, that's really interesting when you think about oil lease auctions and whether the firms actually know what's in the area or not. Clearly there's rate of return to investing and getting the information. Different people, if everyone has the same information, then how do people bid? You hear oil people talk about leaving money on the table in auctions. This asymmetric information is part of thinking about that problem. Chapter 17 talks about externalities and public goods. The whole course up to today has been about how markets are pretty good at solving most of our materialistic problems. And it turns out that some of the problems aren't solved very well by markets. And that's what this chapter starts to introduce. So externalities, which is in the title, is the first thing to think about. If your behavior affects the person next to you, but there's no compensation, then it's unlikely that behavior is efficient like that. If you're worried about global warming, you'll be certainly interested in this chapter. If you're interested in government behavior, you'll be interested in this chapter. So government is one way we've tried to solve some of the problems that markets aren't very good at. Governments have their own problems, and so that's a pretty interesting way to get into those things. And then the last chapter talks about behavioral economics. If you think about our utility theory, it's really simple. It says that your consumption depends on your material consumption. Did I say it right? Your utility depends on your material consumption, and that's it. It doesn't depend on anyone else's consumption, so it's a no jealousy model. It doesn't take into account decisions in a family structure, so everyone has to be unmarried, I guess. It doesn't take into account all the other things that might affect your utility. So that might be integrity and honor, maybe it's salvation, maybe it's power. There's lots of other things that might affect how people behave that have been omitted up to now. And so this chapter starts to introduce some of those concepts and what it might mean for the predictions in our simplistic models. This is a really rapidly developing area of economics, and clearly we're introducing a lot of ideas from other social scientists like psychology. And so it's a fun way to sort of have a look at some of that social integration. So the whole point about our course has been to get you curious about the economy in general and learning about the parts of it that you're interested in. So this has been an overview course. And this course has been to help you learn how to make good decisions. So ceteris paribus thinking is a really powerful tool, which I hope that you've gotten out of this course. Best of luck.